Thanks. As Helen said, I'm also really excited to be able to have this discussion today with Helen. I mean, we've been discussing the findings of our studies since last year, and really been struck by the commonality of some of the findings and the experience of these groups. And so we thought it would be a good idea to have a joint meeting and try and discuss the implications of some of these analyses and what it means for the agencies that are operating on the ground. The particular study I've been leading is a study that was actually commissioned upon the request of UMMIS and the Resident Coordinator's Office in Sudan, and which was funded by DFID, whose support I acknowledge here. We carried out the study over about 6 months last year, between August and November, December, and it was largely carried out by a group of Miss Ria and other national experts that I've with me going in and out. We visited about 15 locations and focused on one area of former Western Kordofan, the western side of southern Kordofan. The rationale for inspiring the study was the ongoing complaint by the Miss Ria to the UN agencies in Abyei, particularly to UMMIS in Abyei, that they had been completely ignored by the aid industry, that there had been no engagement whatsoever with them. And they felt it was about time that there was some analysis of their situation. And of course, not much was done until the clashes in Abyei in May 2008, after which it was felt that it was important to do a study and try and figure out what was going on. And the second thing that actually was really very dominant in the terms of reference for the study was to assess the feasibility of helping the Miss Ria to sedentarize quickly, which we try not to dismiss outright and try to engage with the question that was posed to us. But basically there was an insistent demand by the leaders, so-called leaders, and I'll come to that, of the Miss Ria, that the only option ahead of the referendum in 2011 and the perceived inability to cross south after the referendum was to be helped to sedentarize quickly before 2011. So that's really the backdrop to the study. Let me talk a bit about the context. Basically, we tried to analyze what had happened to the livelihoods of the Miss Ria before being able to provide any analysis of the question that was put to us about the possible sedentarization of the Miss Ria. The Miss Ria are part of the Baggara Arabs, which is a large group that cuts across southwestern areas of Kordofan and southeastern areas of Darfur. The Miss Ria in particular are divided in two main groups, the Zuruk and the Humr, and we just focus on the Humr. The Zuruk live in the northmost side of southern Kordofan. They have shared areas with the Nuba, whereas the Miss Ria area of interaction, the Humr, area of interaction tends to be more with the Dinka in the south, in the northern Bahr el Ghazal. I'm sorry, I struggled to put the map on the slide, but there is a map in the report on page 4, just to give you an idea of the area of concentration of these groups. Internally, what is called Dar Miss Ria is defined by 3 main transhumant routes that run from the north to the south, and is what they're called the western, the central, and the eastern Murhals, where the Miss Ria move from the dry area, the Masyaf, to the Muharraf, the wet areas. We have defined these areas, many other areas where the pastoralists inhabit in dryland, in the drylands of Africa, as non-equilibrium environment. That's basically an area where there is no long-term balance between the people that inhabit the area and the available natural resources. And these are areas that are normally characterized by a very low productivity of the biological productivity of the soil, erratic rainfall, scarce underground water, and extreme temperatures. And these are all features of Dar Miss Ria, and you'll find the details in the study. Drought is frequent. In the northern part of Dar Miss Ria, evidence is of about 1 year in 10. In the southern part, in the northern part, 3 years in 10. The only 2 perennial sort of water sources are the Bahr al Arab, which is the river that divides southern Kordofan from Bahr el Ghazal, and is known also as the Kir River by the Dinka, which is the center of dispute at the moment for the Misriya, and Lake Kalak, more to the east. Helen has already mentioned a number of the external shocks that impacted on the livelihoods of the Abala, but are very similar shocks that impacted on the life of the Misriya. The land policies of the 70s, large tracts of communal land was alienated as a result of the Registered Land Act of 1970, which really changed land use patterns and land access patterns for this group. The erosion of community governance. The native administration was abolished in the 70s, and it was then later on replaced by an appointed native administration. And the appointed native administration saw really a really enormous increase in the number of chiefs appointed. We moved from 3 Nazirs to 17 Amirs, from 17 Obdas to 60 Omdas, and from 100 Sheikhs to 656. So a fragmentation of the community governance that actually sort of helped disintegrate the cohesion of the group as well. The most dramatic impact on the area has been the oil exploration, and I'll discuss that in detail later, so I won't say more now. And of course, the conflict. The Misriya were one of the key groups that worked alongside the government in the North-South conflict. You may have heard the word Murahilin, you may have heard other words that described the Misriya militia that accompanied the number of incursions into Bahr el Ghazal, particularly against the Dinka. And more recently, another shock, at least that's how the Misriya would describe that's really impacted on their livelihoods, has been the Comprehensive Peace Agreement. The Misriya feel that the CPA has profoundly altered their capacity to access resources. Obviously, in the last 2 decades, they've been able to cross the Bahr al Arab, Kir River, move down south, use the pasture, use the grazes at will, take cattle at will as well. Of course, they cannot do that now. What they say is in the south now there is an army. They're not confronting another militia. They're not confronting a tribal militia or armed pastoralists. They are confronting the SPLA army, and for them that is impossible, and they don't have the same type of military support by the national by the NCP in the north. So they see the CPA as having had a very negative, direct impact on their livelihoods, and more fundamentally, they feel betrayed by the government, and I'll say more about that later. What this has meant in the last 2 decades has been a really profound process of adaptation of their livelihood system, and has been really interested to observe some of these changes directly and sort of analyze them through sort of discussions and looking at the literature. The most dramatic one is the decreased mobility of the Misriya. There is really an increased process of sedentarization along the main roads, the oil roads that have been built by the oil companies, and the small towns. We've seen really dramatic increases in the towns. Just to give you some numbers, Mujlad at the end of the 80s had about 10,000 people. Today has gone 90,000. Places like Mukaddama that had 12 families in the 70s, today has got 2,000. In the Bab in 98, and I know that because I visited the Bab in 98, there were 200 families, and now there are 2,033. And it goes on. And you see places like Sitaib, Meiram, where the population has doubled in the last 10 years. That has also led to very visible family splitting strategies, because the majority of the people that live in this settlement are the women and the children. And that has also been because there is an increased recognition of the importance of education and a desire for children to be educated. So children, as a result of the closing of boarding school and lack of availability of educational opportunities for nomadic children, women or children are increasingly left in towns, while some of the men, particularly the young men, continue to go on transhumance. And in towns, they really are involved in very precarious livelihood activities. There's a lot of petty trade, hired labor on the farms where possible, sometimes taking livestock of other people on transhumance. But the shift is more fundamental because what we have seen is also change in the kind of livestock being herded. So there is a very, very dramatic shift towards sheep raising because it's more local, because it can be done on the peripheries of the towns, because sheep can be traded more easily and be sold more easily, and because they, again, feel they have no longer access to enough grazing for their cattle. The number of cattle generally, though, doesn't seem to have decreased, and this was very interesting trying to analyze. But what we have seen is a shift, in the ownership of this livestock, and that's quite typical of, pastoral communities in crisis. So we've seen large herd owners continuing to increase the number of large livestock they own, but a very sharp increase in the number of destitute livestock pastoralists. They either drop out of pastoralism completely or are only able to have a few sheep. Now, what is also accompanied this is very high unemployment rate for youth. The youth that was largely so to speak, employed in the Popular Defense Force, so derived much of their livelihoods from being part of the militia that fought in the war. There are a number of ongoing constraints to their livelihoods, and that's first of all the lack of markets or the difficulty to access markets. Some are sort of transient. For instance, the export ban as a result of the suspected Rift Valley fever in Sudan had a really significant impact on the capacity of the Missouri to sell livestock for export. But more importantly, what we kept hearing was the fact that the traders would not go to the western part of southern Kordofan any longer because of fear of insecurity, because all the main roads have been sort of subject to attacks by some of the groups that were formerly part of the PDF. I'll talk about these groups in a minute, so you'll have a clearer idea of what's happening in terms of insecurity. But basically, this is preventing people from trading because they're afraid of there are no banks in Mujlad, so they have to bring the cash with them to be able to trade, and they are obviously susceptible to being attacked. As in the same is taking livestock back north, they feel it's too risky, and so they're not willing to do that anymore. There are obvious constraints to production because the constraints in terms of mobility also mean that they access areas too late. They access areas where the nutritional value of the pasture has already decreased, and so as a result, the livestock is unable to benefit from the grazing as much as it should. But the most dramatic challenge is the oil exploration. We've heard an extraction. We've heard that incessantly wherever we've been, how much the oil industry has impacted on their capacity to continue to survive, really. And that's in terms of the access to land they've lost as a result of the oil industry that has taken up large tracts of this land. But more importantly, in terms of the pollution of the grazing and the water, again, it's very difficult because obviously there are not proper environmental assessments of this region. Although there have been a number of studies done locally by employees of the Ministry of Agriculture in El Fula who have been, and we've said that in the report, immediately reprimanded for that. But there is a number of indicators that point to the impact on the livestock in terms of decreased fertility, increased mortality of the livestock. And the other very visible thing is the really vast deforestation of the area. I travel very regularly throughout Sudan, and you do see a lot of charcoal and firewood being sold along the road in many parts of northern Sudan. But the amount of firewood and charcoal I've seen in the western side of southern Kordofan is really astonishing. We've seen almost kilometers of firewood lined up, and sort of land totally barren around it. And the justification, and the interesting thing is they tend to be alongside security outposts, and local people complain there's usually the military or security forces that are responsible for the deforestation and control the trade. And we have also tried to talk to some of the military that are allegedly responsible for the deforestation, and their justification is that these areas will eventually be used for oil extraction, so it is legitimate to cut the firewood. The other sort of indirect impact of the extraction has been that the roads that have been built in these areas have created almost sort of dams. Because there has been no drainage built along the roads, what you see is very dry areas north of the road and areas very dry areas south of the road, and areas that are completely flooded north of the road because the road acts as a dam, and that which means that both the north and the side areas around the roads are unusable for pasture. And last, another impact of the explorations has been that people have started doing what they've been doing in Darfur for a number of years, creating this air fencing, sort of delimiting these areas, Zaribat al-Hawa, they call them, where they sort of decide an area belongs to them, and so that they can sort of sell it to the oil company, because compensation is being paid individually and not to the tribe as a whole. And I could go on forever, but I think what is significant for people is that all of this has been happening, but there has been no compensation for them, no compensation in terms of services, in terms of infrastructure that they would have liked to have seen. As Helen said for Diabala, also for the Miseria, there are hardly any indicators, but we have general indicators for Western Kordofan and Southern Kordofan at large that point to some of the highest malnutrition and infant mortality, for instance, in northern Sudan. And yet you see hardly any services, particularly in areas where there are nomadic communities that have basically no access to health services, schools, and so forth. And where there has been any kind of so-called compensation by the companies has been the odd borehole really built to very low standards without proper assessments, which usually breaks down within a year, or the odd electricity grid like in Sitaib that again breaks down within 6 months. So people feel cheated because obviously they see that their livelihoods are being profoundly affected, but there is no compensation. I will skip the discussion of the external assistance in the past. There has been a large amount of investment in these areas in the past, a number of projects. They're all described in the report. And the report describes how they were sort of, often based on wrong assumptions around the livelihoods of these groups. But I'll just talk about the assistance post the peace agreement, because again, that's what led us to sort of initiate, led UMIS and DFID to commission the report. And there has been, it's true, very, very little engagement in this area. There is hardly any NGO in this area. Even after funds were made available by the donors, there has been hardly any presence. And whilst it is easy to understand why it is easier and perhaps also more appropriate to respond in Abyei and to address the Dinka community, it is quite striking that there has been such a presence in Abyei town and Bahr al-Ghazal and hardly any farther north. And again, we discussed that in the report. There are some clear reasons. It's much harder to negotiate a travel permit to go to Mujlad and engage with HAC in Khartoum, whereas you can go in Juba and sort of be up in Abyei within 2 days with the blessing of the government of Southern Sudan. But that can be a justification for completely excluding one community, especially when this community is so intertwined in a conflict with the community you are supporting in the south. And I think what we have seen in Abyei in 2008 has been a clear example of the rage that there was in the Miseria communities, because some of the things that have happened during the clashes have been the destruction of the new electricity plant down to the last wire. The Miseria were really enraged that Abyei had become this really sort of nice little town with so many services, whereas nobody had ever bothered even talk to them farther north. And that is something that needs really needs to make us think about how we develop our programs of assistance. Just a few words on the current dynamics, just to tell you what's happening today in terms of the political situation in the area. This is an area that is incredibly volatile, where the level of insecurity was very high when we did the study, is even higher today. We were told very clearly in a number of communities that we were mad to be there, that we were risking our lives, and so were, my colleagues, my Sudanese colleagues, were threatened very directly. It was striking how in a number of communities on the Western Mural, there was no government presence. These were controlled by paramilitary groups. The display of weapons, of arms, was incredibly visible and very deliberate as well. We were told to leave the area immediately because they were planning attacks, and it was interesting. We negotiated with some of these groups to stay another couple of days, and the day after we left, the 9 Chinese workers were kidnapped. 5 of whom were killed later on. So they're very, very tangible, the threats. And wherever we traveled, we saw the burned cars. And the interesting thing is that the leaders there were telling us that these groups are not worried about being recognized. They leave their names after the attacks. They want the government to know that they are exasperated, and they feel that the government is responsible for what's happening. I'll give you just a very quick idea of the main groups. We've tried, in the report, there is a very sort of clear description of the groups we have tried to identify. They are largely the result of the fragmentation of the Popular Defense Force. Some of them have gone into this group, you may have heard the name, called Shahama. There's been quite active in the area. There's had some engagement with the GEM. It's not clear to what extent it is supported by GEM. It is linked to GEM. There is a GEM link. You can't pin it down to what extent, but it's clear that the GEM has had a presence in the area. There is some sort of some rapport. Some are actually in Darfur now working with the GEM. Others are still sort of there under this sort of Shahama name. But the most worrying group is the non-aligned ex-PDF fighters, who are profoundly enraged by the fact that they've been dumped. That's what they would say after the end of the conflict, after the CPA, and they cannot find a job anywhere. What they did was be part of the militia. They have not been reabsorbed in the oil sector. They cannot be absorbed in the oil sector because they don't have a national service certificate, which is the sort of the minimum element that they need. And I can tell you in the discussion later, more why this is the case. But basically, they feel that they have no options. They don't have cattle anymore. They don't have, the possibility to go and raid down south. They're stuck with no options to how to support their families. So, and they hold the government responsible for that. Now, this has worried, as you can imagine, the leadership of the Misriya profoundly. So there have been some attempts to create more sympathetic groups. They've been trying to have a dialogue with the government. But after 2 years of dialogue, there's been a feeling that not much has been happening. So just to tell you, recently what's been happening, there has been a rapprochement between the NCP and some elements of the Misriya, but others still feel betrayed also by the roadmap and the arbitration. And is the news of just 2 days ago, the gathering in Sitave, where many of these groups have promised to continue to fight the arbitration, find the implementation of the arbitration decision. Also because there is a number of the areas where the Misri are settled, more to the north of the Abyei area, would imply that they have to leave. Our conclusions are very similar to Helen's conclusions, and really, call for a serious engagement in investing in these groups on a number of levels. I mean, obviously, the main conclusion on the sedentarization was that this was, an unrealistic and very, and actually not really something that the Misriya themselves wanted. It was almost an elite dream. But what is very clear is that there is to be a very urgent re-engagement along a number of lines. reconciliation, engagement with the youth, identifying livelihoods opportunities, and we have a number of suggestions and recommendations for that, and also interventions to make the livestock sector more productive. But we can discuss that more later, because I don't want to take any more time. Sorry, I've gone massively over time.
No, well, thank you, Sara.